Good evening and welcome to Trust in Atira. My name is Colin O'Rourke. I'm the administrator for 1798 Rebellion Casualty Database. I'm hosting this evening's talk as it's quite connected to myself as I am from South Wicklow. This talk is based on the Fitzwilliam clearances of 1847 to 1856. We thank Jim Rees for coming on tonight to give us this talk. So we hope you enjoy it. Jim is a passionate historical author with a history master's degree from NUI Maynooth. He's had a lifelong passion for both history and literature and has written extensively and lectured widely on topics such as immigration and maritime history. This lecture is based off Jim's most famous publication, Surplus People, The Great Famine in Ireland, as we know, was a catastrophe of immense proportions. Death after eviction, starvation and emigration was widespread. Landlords eager to dispose of surplus tenants engaged in assisted passages, whereby tenants were given financial incentives to emigrate. The clearances of uneconomic tenants from the 85,000-acre Coolattin Estate in South County Wicklow by Lord Fitzwilliam was the most organised in Ireland during and after the famine years. From 1847 to 1856, Fitzwilliam removed 6,000 men, women and children and arranged passage from New Ross in County Wexford to Canada on emigrant ships such as the Dunbrody. Most were destitute and many were ill on arrival in Quebec and New Brunswick. Hunger and overcrowding at quarantine stations such as the infamous Grosse Ile resulted in further disease and death. This lecture will explore this tragedy, from why the clearances occurred, to who went and where and how families would have fared in Canada. So we welcome Jim here tonight, and we hope you have a good evening.
Thank you very much. I take it the ball's in my court now, Liam. So I'll start the ball rolling. Is that okay?
That's okay, Jim.
Okay. This is kind of strange. Usually when I'm talking to a group of people, I usually see the group. I've never done one of these before, so if it comes across that way, forgive me. Hopefully I'll warm up as I get into it. Surplus people, a lot of people ask me where I got the title, because let's face it, it's a disgraceful phrase. To me, it's a disgraceful phrase. How can people be surplus? They're surplus to requirements or whatever. But it's the actual phrase that is used in the Fitzwilliam estate books and the estate papers. We're actually very lucky in that the Fitzwilliam estate, and you'll see in a few minutes where that was, the Fitzwilliam estate was one of the best documented, one of the best managed and run. And now, of course, it's one of the most historically accessible because of those records are still intact and they're in the National Museum, the National Library in Ireland up in Dublin. But that's where, and in those papers, they refer to the people that want off the estate as the surplus people. And you'll see how that comes into play now in a moment. So we'll move on, but before we do, I just want to tell people, if any of you have this book already, and that's what you see there now is the first edition of it, it's the first printing of it. It came out again as a reprint a few years ago with a different cover, with that cover. Don't rush out and get this one if you have the other one. It's the same book, it's just a different cover. Although if you want to rush out and get it, I'm not going to stop you. Well, here we are, surplus people. The area we are talking about, there's two counties here. There's County Wicklow on top and County Wexford, both in the southeast corner of Ireland. And the Fitzwilliam estate straddled those two counties. It was a massive estate. In Wicklow in the 1840s, Wicklow County, like everywhere else in Ireland, was divided up among landlords. Big estates, small estates, in between. In Wicklow, Fitzwilliam was by far the biggest. By 1840, he had 80,000 acres. After the famine, by 1880, he had 90,000 acres. So the famine didn't do the Fitzwilliam estate any harm at all. In fact, they acquired an extra 10,000 acres. And on this map, you will see the names of the different landowners with Fitzwilliam down in the bottom left corner. And he had pockets dotted all over the county as well, including places like the towns of Rathdrum, the town, Wicklow town itself, the county seat. Fitzwilliam owned those towns. The only image I could get during my research of Fitzwilliam, the Fitzwilliams were in the area for several hundred years and were the Earls Fitzwilliam. There was the first Earl, the second Earl, third Earl. This was the fourth Earl. And the only image I could find of him was as a 16-year-old boy. Now, he was in his 40s during the famine. So, unfortunately, I can't show you what he looked like. But one thing for sure, one thing I can tell you, he didn't have horns. He was not a daemon. And in fact, the Fitzwilliams had a very good reputation as being, I find it very hard to put the words good and landlord side by side, but if there are such things as good landlords, the Fitzwilliams were among the best of a bad bunch, basically. They would look after their tenants as much as they could, but when it come down to survival of the tenants or survival of the estate, it was always going to be the estate. And understandably, I suppose that's what they were. You'd often hear landed gentry people saying that they're curators of their properties, not their big houses. And that's exactly the way they looked at it. But to tell you, this is their house. This is the house down in South Wicklow. It's Coolattin House near Grosse Ile. And that is not a particularly big house. The really big house, they have estates over in England as well, in Yorkshire. And their estates over there is where the real money was. And in fact, their house on the Yorkshire estate outside Sheffield has the longest frontage of any private dwelling house in Britain. It is something like 150 feet longer than Buckingham Palace. This is the type of money we were talking about. They had the estates in Yorkshire, Northamptonshire, and they had the Irish estates. Now, the relationship with the tenants was quite good. They were open to negotiation. If you improved your property on the estate, they would actually help you. If they didn't give you financial help towards it, they would give you reduction in rent for a period of maybe 2, 3, 4 years until everybody benefited that way. Whereas in Ireland, throughout Ireland, many landlords, there was no incentive to improve your property if you were a tenant, because if you improved your property, that meant it had a higher value, and that meant you were going to pay a higher rent. So why would you improve your property? Whereas the Fitzwilliams did encourage improvement. They also encouraged education, to finance schools. And at the time, the 1820s, 1830s, and before, they financed not only Catholic schools for Catholic children and Protestant schools for Protestant children, but actually what they preferred was they financed mixed schools, very much ahead of their time. So they were very good like that. They were also open to helping people build churches. This photograph and the next two are just 3 of the many churches on their estates that the Fitzwilliams actually put money into. In many cases, they gave the site for the church, and they gave an adjacent site for a house for the parish priest. So as I said, they were, as landlords went, they were fairly good. One thing about it that they couldn't really get away from was some of the existing laws that had been in place since the penal times, since the late 1690s, but particularly from 1710 and 1715 onwards. Now, under those laws, they were called the Penal Laws, and it was definitely, purposely, strictly anti-Catholic. And it was to take away, it was to try and eradicate Catholicism from Ireland. And one of the ways they wanted to do that, in around 1700, there were almost as many big Catholic landowners as there were Protestant. But one of the series of penal laws to come in was to change inheritance rights in if tenants, a tenant could actually inherit a tenancy from his father and so on. Let's take an example. If you were a Protestant farmer and you had 4 sons, and you had, let's make it simple, you had a holding of 40 acres, then when you died, your property, your farm, your tenant farm was kept intact, and it went to the eldest son. So it was still a 40 acre farm. The younger sons were given a cash payment, and most of them headed out to Canada or the colonies until the 1780s, and of course, which became the United States. And so that is why many of the early Irish immigrants were younger sons of Protestant landowners. Now, let's take the same scenario, but instead of saying a man has a 40-acre farm and 4 sons, let's say he's a Catholic. Well, under the penal laws, that farm had to be broken up equally among all the sons. So suddenly, instead of one farm of 40 acres, a generation down, there were now 4 farms of 10 acres each. And the same thing happened. That subdivision happened the next generation, and the next, and the next. Until by the 1820s, the vast majority of ordinary Irish people who were Catholic were eking a living off a holding of 1 acre, half an acre, 2 acres, totally unviable. And that was a direct result of the land being subdivided all the time. And that was the law. Now, on a small holding like that, there is only one crop that you could grow and to feed your family from, and that was potato. And potato was the miracle food of the time. There was enough nutrition in it to feed a family for a year off a very, very small plot. That's why then most people were, by 1840, most people, the vast majority of people were totally dependent on potato for their food. The one downside of the potato was it was very, very prone to infection and blight. And in 1845, sure enough, that's what happened. That blight had started in America, actually, and then it crossed over the Atlantic, and it was shown, it appeared first in early 1845 in Belgium, and then into France. And then in September, it appeared in Ireland for the first time. In October, it appeared in South Wicklow for the first time. And what happened with the potato plants with this blight was the first you knew that something was seriously wrong was a terrible stink. It's absolutely putrid. The descriptions all agree. It's absolutely vile. And what was a healthy field of potatoes the previous day was now just a field of brown, rotten mush. The plants were dying, and you went out, and as you just dug into the ground to see what the tubers were like, they just rotted away. They were just balls of pus, basically. This was catastrophic. This meant that the majority of people in Ireland were facing at their main food crop being destroyed. Now, the whole crop of 1845 was not destroyed, about half it was. So this happened on a regular basis, by the way. We talk about the famine in the 1840s. We more correctly refer to it as the Great Famine, because potato blight was a regular visitor here. There were famines in the 1700s. There was a big one in the 1820s. But the 1840s famine, nobody could have predicted just how bad it was going to be. And there was the belief that, well, look, we'll just sit tight, we'll get the charitable organizations in place, we'll set up soup kitchens and all the other paraphernalia, and we'll sit this season out, and hopefully everything will be right next year. There was a system of government aid as well called the Poor Law system. And the Poor Law had been set up in 1838. Under the Poor Law, Ireland was divided into 130 different poor law unions around the country, and each union had to build a workhouse, and that's the image of the workhouse there. You can see it's the structure, the complex is absolutely perfectly symmetrical. One half is the mirror image of the other. And these were vile places. If you want to have an idea of what the impact on the individual and on families was in going into the workhouse, you had to be really destitute. The idea was these were funded by the ratepayers. So the ratepayers made sure there was a regime that you really had to be desperate before you would go into the workhouse. Because if you have a family, a father, mother, son, daughter, and they went into that workhouse, the daughter, as a young female, would go into one side. Her mother would go into the same side, but in another block. The father would go in on the other side for the males, while his son, as a boy, would go into a different block, especially for boys. So that family was totally split up, and they were allowed to meet up for 1 hour of a Sunday afternoon, 1 hour a week, with the condition that it didn't interrupt the running of the workhouse. Now, of course, that left it wide open for abuse and everything. So if the manager didn't feel like giving that free association for the 1 hour, he just said, no, it's not suitable, and that's it. Time is over. There were terrible, terrible places. And as I said, there were 130 of these around Ireland. The whole system was geared to cater for 100,000 paupers, as the poor people were referred to. And that really did ease the burden a great deal. Well, it brought the poor people off the streets and hid them away there, and they were called workhouses for a reason. This was not a holiday camp. You went in and you worked in there, whether it was making bags or mail bags and all that type of thing. Whatever drudgery and nonsensical work had to be done, you had to do it. That was okay for 1841, 42, 43, 44. Suddenly 1845, the potato blight hits. By 1846 actually, the potato crop in 1846 was quite good. People hadn't expected it. And it wasn't great, but it got by on that. But there was still a hangover from the loss of the previous year, where half the crop was lost. So there were more demands on the workhouses throughout Ireland than there had been. By 1847, the worst year of the famine, where it was almost 100% annihilation of the crop, instead of 100,000 paupers walking the roads of Ireland, there were now 1 million, 10 times what the system could cater for. So in 1847, they realized, look, we can't, these workhouses can't cope with this. So we have to introduce new measures. And one of the new measures introduced was the outdoor relief system. Before, you couldn't get any relief. If you wanted food, you wanted a bit of bread, whatever, you had to go inside. Now in 1847, they said, right, we'll open up soup kitchens right around Ireland. And we're going to bill, now this was the British government, of course, and we are going to bill the landlords in Ireland for that extra expense. We're putting it back on them. So suddenly it became cheaper for the landlords who were going to have to finance these soup kitchens. Now, some soup kitchens were set up by English charitable organisations, particularly some religious groups like the Society of Friends, the Quakers. Wonderful work, and other voluntary groups were very good, but the British government did basically nothing. It made a complete nonsense of what had gone on in 1800, when the Act of Union said that that England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland now were all one country and they would be treated the same. Well, if the famine had broken out in Kent or Surrey, the British government would have responded. They didn't hear. So it made nonsense of the Act of Union. which was a nonsense anyway. But all that you can see in this lower photograph, in this lower image, where you see the people, bad as it was in the workhouse, trying to get in there. It's soup kitchens all over the place as well. Now, all this expense, they're there trying to get into the workhouse. All this expense meant it became cheap for landlords to get out the financial slide rule and do a few calculations. Would it be cheaper to send most of their unviable tenants or their surplus people across the Atlantic? Because emigration was the only way out. This is a very famous image that there was a magazine published in London, the Illustrated London News, and they came over and an awful lot of very emotive images and all in there. And it's great that we have these, but these is one of them. This shows the local priest blessing people from his parish who were going to make the long trek across the Atlantic. Most people who had the money decided to go to pay. It cost £5. If you wanted to go to the United States from Ireland, you could go from Dublin or Galway or Cork or Derry, but it was £5. But if you went to Canada, the fare to Canada was only £3, 10 shillings or £3.50. So what a lot of people did actually, they bought tickets and they went to Canada and then just walked south over the border into the States, those who had some idea of the geography of it. But this would be a very, very familiar scene. There's 20 years ago, when it was the 150th anniversary of the famine, many local historians and local historical societies researched their own areas as never before. How was their area impacted? And it's remarkable the similarities that happened everywhere. And this was ubiquitous. The parish priest blessing families to head off. There's so many people going. There had been immigration to the States for 100 years, but there were small trickles, basically. What the famine did in Ireland was it turned a trickle into a torrent. And the British government knew that they would have to bring in a series of passenger acts. This one is from 1849, but there was one in 1841 as well. Now, this was supposed to look after the interests of the passengers. It really did nothing of the kind. Apart from anything else, that even the few benefits that were in it for passengers, in many cases, were overlooked. To give you some idea, many captains of emigrant ships, alcohol was not allowed on emigrant ships. You could not have booze on board. But one of the perks, and this came up time and time again, the newspapers are full of it, where captains were brought to court because not only did they allow drink on board, but they looked on it as their prerogative as making, and were selling, bring it on board. They were the only supply, and they were charging 3 times the amount for the booze. They were actually making a packet out of it. So there were passenger acts. They did try their best up to a point, but they were just ignored. Another example of it being ignored was here at the government offices. Now, this is an image again from the Illustrated London News, but it's in Liverpool. And you can see that every passenger, under the Passenger Act, every passenger had to be medically examined. Now, it says on here, here's the medical inspector's office. The hours are from 10 until 4. Now, even allowing that they'll work diligently for those 6 hours. In one day, on one particular day in Liverpool, there were 12,000 passengers left Liverpool in one day. There was one doctor on, and say he was on for the 6 hours. I worked this out with the calculator, by the way. Each medical examination took about 1.2 seconds. So people filed by him, and people who even looked sickly were allowed on board. But to make it even worse was, with the different ship diseases, typhus particularly, that you could be perfectly healthy today have it inside the typhus in you, incubating, but it wouldn't show for 2 or 3 days. So you could be perfectly healthy walking through there, but you would still spread it through your ship over the next 6 weeks, because the average voyage, even in good weather, was 5 to 6 weeks. In bad weather, it could be up to 3 months, but we'll come to that now in a moment. So there were passenger acts, but they were useless, totally ignored. This is another scene. This scene is actually from Cork, and you can see how chaotic it was at the quayside. Earl Fitzwilliam had heard, Earl, by the way, a lot of Americans, if they're giving this talk in the States, they sometimes think that Earl was his Christian name. It was his title. He was the Earl Fitzwilliam. So he was the 4th Earl. His name was actually William Fitzwilliam. But Fitzwilliam decided, he heard such bad reports of what happened at these immigration ports like Liverpool, like Dublin, like Cork, Galway to a lesser extent, that he decided that the estate would organise the clearance he needed off the estate. And I put this down that Fitzwilliam does it himself. Well, he took a very active interest in it, but really it was down to his agent, Robert Challoner. And Challoner was a remarkable man. The work he took on there, and I think he was genuinely sincere. And again, they're recorded in 2 large ledgers that are in the National Library now at the moment, called the Fitzwilliam Emigration Books. And Fitzwilliam had a tenant population of 22,000 on his 80,000 acre estate. It was 1/6 of the county of Wicklow, and there were 22,000 tenants. So he decided they were going to reduce that by a quarter, best part of a quarter. So in the emigration books, between 1847 and 1856, most in 1847, 48, and 49, the names of every man, woman, and child who had been identified who should emigrate, their names, their ages, their family relationships, all that information is there. And in fact, it can be accessible online now, which I'll come and mention that at the end of the talk for anybody who'd like to do research. Wonderful, wonderful source material. But also what he wanted, he didn't want his tenants going to the United States for 2 reasons. One was, as I said, the cost to go to the United States was £5 a head. The cost to go to Canada was £3.10 a head. So obviously for 6,000 tenants, he was going to save a lot by them going to Canada. As well as that, Canada was still known then, it was before the Federation of Canada in 1867, it was still known as British North America. So he wasn't sending them out of Britain to a certain extent, he was sending them across to a British colony on the far side of the Atlantic, which I want to come at again because most of them were sent to Quebec, and except for one ship, which we'll come to. This is the type of ship that went on. This is a drawing of the replica Dunbrody that is now down at New Ross. And actually, if anybody has been at New Ross and to see the Dunbrody famine ship, where she is moored at that quay, that's the actual quay that the Fitzwilliam tenants left from in the 1840s and into the 1850s. The shipping agent was William Graves. Anybody driving around this part of Ireland, they will see sheds on farms and haggards and everything else, and William Graves, New Ross, written on a steel plaque on them. And that's what the business got into later, building these sheds and so on. But in the 1840s, they were actually shipping agents. And it was, they came to a deal with the Fitzwilliam estate that they would ship the people out to Quebec. And the ships, one thing I'm always very careful to point out is the quality of the ships used in the famine. we have this image of coffin ships, and we hear about coffin ships. And don't get me wrong, coffin ships did exist. There's no two ways about it. Leaky tubs that should have been scrapped years before were brought into service to cater for this new great business called famine immigration. And many of them foundered. Thousands of people lost their lives on badly made ships, ships long past their sell-by date. The ships used by Graves for the Fitzwilliam clearance were very, very good ships. All of them, at the time of use, were either still in or just barely out of an A1 Lloyd's classification. A1, we use it in everyday parlance now, was something that's the best. Well, A1 originated as Lloyd's best classification for ships. They were very good ships. They were excellent. And they were newly built ships in many cases. The problem is they were built as cargo ships. They were built to carry timber. They were built to carry molasses and wool and things like that. They were not built as to carry human cargo. They were not built to carry passengers. And so the conditions on board the ships, I always use the phrase, there were coffin ships that were totally irredeemable. But even on the good ships, there were coffin ship conditions because the ships were used for the wrong purpose. But the Dunbrody was one of them. When you went on board the ship to go across the Atlantic, the very last thing that happened, you went on board and you claimed your bunk. You were put down below in the tween decks. And the bunks didn't look too bad when you got on board first. We'll see some of them now in a minute. They were 6 feet square. And so 6 foot square, that's not bad. Like, right, I'm stuck here for 6 weeks, but at least I have a bit of space. The 6 feet square bunks were not for one person. They were not for 2 people. They were not for 3 people. They were for 4 people. Now that gives each person a space of 6 feet by 18 inches. 9 square feet, if my maths is right. Now, again, this is where the Passenger Act was useless, because under the Passenger Act, everybody was entitled to 12 square feet of space. But they didn't even get that, they got 9 square feet, 6 feet by 18 inches. At the start, in the early years of the famine migration, everybody was lumped in together. Young girls had to share a bunk with some strange man, with, in many cases, the almost predictable consequences. So again, one of the things that came in 1849 in the review of the Passenger Acts in 1849 was to make sure that the sexes were to be separated, strictly separated. The ideal was if you were traveling with friends or your large family, you grouped together as much as you possibly could. And because it was fairly easy with Fitzwilliam, because there were so many Fitzwilliam tenants traveling on the same ships at any time, that it was easy enough to have support within the group and feel that comfort of people around you, that you knew people who you met on a daily basis, had grown up with, and so on. But there were really bad conditions. So you could be on 2 or 3 days before they finally give the word that we're getting ready to sail. And this image here is the last thing that would happen. The shipping agent would stand up, you'd get all the crowd together on the poop deck, and you would call out all the names of the passengers. It would also be a certain amount of prayers read for the preparation of the voyage. And then you were ready to cast off. This image of a sailing ship being towed downriver by a steamer, this one is from Belfast in 1847. But this could very, very easily be New Ross. New Ross is 16 miles from the sea. And of course, sailing ship couldn't navigate down there, too narrow. Would have had to be pulled down by a steamer and very narrow channel. That image you see there is the image that people who are waving off Fitzwilliam tenants would have seen at New Ross. And of course, the idea was to cross the Atlantic and to go to Canada. And the aim was to get to Quebec. So once you've got the Atlantic behind you, and as I say, that could take 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. If the winds were against you, it could take up to 12 weeks. Now, the problem with that is, because the average voyage lasted about 5 or 6 weeks, the provisions brought on board the ship were to last for 5 or 6 weeks. So when it looked as if you were going to be a 10 or 11 or 12-week voyage, the rations, meagre as they were cut to make them last that 10, 11 or 12 weeks. It was horrific. Also, there were images shown in the different publications about what it was like to sail the Atlantic. Just keep that idea of the rations in the back of your mind now for a moment. I would just park it to one side, but keep it there. When I first saw this image of dancing in the 'tween decks on an emigrant ship, I thought, very fanciful nonsense. I didn't see how it could be right, but actually it's correct. And as you do more research into it, that music was encouraged because in a very, very tight space, dancing was a very good form of exercise. It also took the people's minds off the whole worry about the situation and the cramped conditions and everything else. And there was one very famous emigrant ship. This has nothing to do with the Fitzwilliam clearance now, but just to give you an idea of how true this image is. One very famous emigrant ship that sank off the coast of Wexford was the Pomona in 1848, just off Blackwater in Wexford. And there were over 400 people lost on her. And the reason she hit the Blackwater bank and took on water, most of the people were in the 'tween decks, and all the reports say this, they were in the 'tween decks dancing at the time. So it is a true image. It took me, I think it was about a year or 18 months, I used to laugh at that image, but it's actually probably one of the truest you're going to get. This is what the bunks might have looked like when the people went on board first. In reality, after a few days, this is what they look like. You will see the bunks there, the 2-tier, and each bunk is 6 foot by 6. There were no toilets, and you could have 300 people crammed into the space. As I said, if any of you have been down at the Dunbrody, imagine squeezing 300 people in there. The toilets were still facilities were buckets and anything else you could use. So there's absolutely no privacy whatsoever. But even worse than that, once you got over that, there was the stench. And particularly if you hit bad weather, as soon as you got out into the Atlantic, these people were land-based people. They were farmers. They were not sailors. So they were getting sick. Dysentery set in. The more I research, famine immigration across the Atlantic is not the I'm no longer amazed by how many people died. I'm amazed at how many people survived. It was absolutely, this was your worst nightmare multiplied by 1,000. A terrible, terrible time. Also, you had to queue up for your food. And you can see, if it's stormy, you still had to eat. You couldn't keep getting sick on an empty stomach. And there would be hot soup. The chances of getting scalded in those conditions, as well as, it's just generally, the whole thing was horrific. Finally, you get to Quebec, and it's great. You can imagine them after their weeks at sea, and they're coming up to, they can see land, and they see Canada, and they can see Quebec province, and I think the journey's over. Well, no, there's still about 10 days to go, because you have to get past Newfoundland, you have to get up into the St. Lawrence Seaway, you have to get down the St. Lawrence Seaway to Quebec. But before you could get to Quebec, you stopped here, looking in the middle of that map, you'll see Grosse Ile. And Grosse Ile figures very, very strongly in particularly the Canadian psyche of Irish descendants of people who went through Grosse Ile in the 1840s. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. You're in this wonderful wide seaway. I was there in the middle of summer and it was gorgeous. But like everybody else on board that boat that went down there, not one of us came off Grosse Ile smiling, because it is just, I've heard people talk about who've gone to Dachau and Auschwitz and places like that, and they said, there's something in the air, you cannot come away lighthearted. And Grosse Ile is like that. In 1847, there were, I'll give you the figures after in a few moments. I haven't got them off the top of my head, but ships were coming in 3 and 4 a day at first, then 10 or 12 a day, hundreds of people on each. Now, they weren't only coming in from Ireland, there were immigrants coming in from across Europe, from Germany, from France. But they said you could always tell the Irish ship from about 2 miles away because of the smell. The people were so badly looked after. And also, the rigging of the Irish ships, or the Irish immigrant ships, were festooned with rags, which was their clothes, which had got wet during the voyage. The German ships, even if they had clothes out drying, they were very good clothes, they were very respectable clothes, but said you could actually tell the Irish ships immediately. One very famous, as the summer went on in Grosse Ile, the situation became absolutely dire, as we'll see in a moment. Before you got off the ship, there was another medical inspection. And again, if you were sick, which the chances are you were after 6 weeks at sea, you were sent into the huts, the sleeping huts that had been erected on Grosse Ile. As there were doctors, there were nurses, but nowhere near enough. There were some wonderfully brave people. There were the Grey Nuns. I can't remember exactly which order it is now, it's gone, but they're known as the Grey Nuns from Montreal. They came up, and Quebec, and they acted as nurses. There were doctors who put themselves at risk. There was one Irish doctor from Kilkenny who, when he arrived as an immigrant on board ship, it was his plan to go to Quebec, get to Montreal, and go down then into the United States. But when he saw the absolutely dire conditions on Grosse Ile, he said he would give himself a month or two to help out there. But he didn't last a week. He died within a week. And there were other cases like that where people sacrificing themselves for the people who were really badly off. George Millis Douglas, he was in charge of Grosse Ile, and the jury is out on how he conducted himself. There's some think he did a great job. There's others point to examples of abuse and racketeering and things like that. I don't know, I can't make my mind up. Was he a goodie, was he a baddie, or was he like 90% of us? Was he a mixture? These are the typical huts, the hospital huts that the people were put into. Very, very basic. There was one of them still in existence up to about 15 years ago. I'm not sure if it still is or not. But that was the inside of it. And if you look at it, it's remarkably like the tween decks that the people thought they had escaped. You got the same tiered bunks and everything else. And people were dying 3, 4, 5 a day. By September, October, they were dying in their dozens every day on Grosse Ile. There were mass graves, as you can see this image here. That is the graveyard on Grosse Ile. Now, forget the crosses. They're only representative. They do not mark individual graves. You'll see the humps and hollows and furrows in that there. I was going to say nobody knows how many people are buried, but actually they know exactly how many people are buried there, and there's over 5,000. We'll come to. Also on Grosse Ile is this memorial. it was put up to the Irish famine immigrants in 1909. It was put up by the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And you will see a bronze plaque on the base. Well, there are 3 of them actually. There's one on either side and that one. One's in French, one's in Irish, and one's in English. The one in French merely explains that, yeah, this is to the Irish people who are fleeing the famine. But don't forget French because it was in Quebec. These are to the Irish famine victims, you know, and who were buried, and the Irish wish to thank the Quebecois for their kindness and their help. So that's that one. The one in English says again, yes, that this is Grosse Ile was a quarantine station for people fleeing the famine in Ireland. No, sorry, didn't mention the famine. These are fleeing poverty. And basically, it reads as if this was a career move, that we're only going out for a better life in America. No mention of the famine or anything else. The one in Irish translates into English as, this memorial is to Irish immigrants, men, women, and children who are fleeing British opposition or oppression in Ireland. And it goes on for given a litany and actually the truth of what the situation was. Here are the figures. In Grosse Ile, in the summer of 1847, 98,000 immigrants passed through on 442 ships from different parts of Europe. Now, 98,000, almost 79,000 of those were Irish. Over 4,000 has died at sea, and almost 5,500 died and are buried on Grosse Ile. So very, very sad time. Over the 10 years of the Fitzwilliam clearances, all the ships went in. There was about 20 voyages using, I think it was 9 different ships. And all of them went into Quebec, except for one, and that was the Star. In 1848, the Star left New Ross for St. Andrews, a very small town, beautiful, beautiful place now, but a very small town in the province of New Brunswick. And it's very strange because it's on a river and there's a bridge across the river. And on the far side of the bridge is a town called Calais, C-A-L-A-I-S, pronounce it Calais. And that bridge, St. Andrews is in New Brunswick in Canada. Calais is in the state of Maine in the United States. And there's only a bridge of 100 yards or so spanning the river. So it actually is the international border boundary just there. That's important, as you'll see now in a moment. Again, the important thing was to try, people are trying to get down into the States for the most. I don't have that many images here of what happened in St. Andrews. So I will just tell you from a few notes I had here. And bear with me, the images are much better. But unfortunately, I have spent the last few weeks trying to find some of the images I had, and I can't find them. So bear with me. The big question is, why was the Star, why did the Star go to New Brunswick? Why did it go to St. Andrews? Why break the pattern? And the reason for that was St. Andrews was in the middle of a process to get a railway line to link with Quebec City. And Lord Fitzwilliam, Earl Fitzwilliam here in County Wicklow, one of his main interests were development of railways in Ireland, in Britain, and now we had a chance to do it in Canada as well. And he came up with this idea. He got in touch with the railway company and he said, look, I need to get rid of 300 able-bodied workers off my estate here in Ireland. Will you be able to supply them with 3 months' work building your railway? And he said, now you will have to have accommodation ready for them and there will have to be work there for them. And they said, well, no, we can't really afford 300 extra workers. He said, I'll pay their wages, which was very good. This was great. This was going to cost about £1,000, which is massive money in 1847. It's when you get into the railway company records that you realise for that £1,000, Fitzwilliam also got 1,000 extra shares in the railway company. He was already the biggest European shareholder in it, and he got an extra £1,000 worth of shares by supplying these surplus people off his estate. Okay, so he saw a way of making money, but it didn't work out like that. When the Star arrived in New Brunswick, in St. Andrews, it wasn't 300 able-bodied workers on board, it was 300 families. In all, there was over 600. It was just short of, there was 600 men, women, and children. Many of them were frail. They were too young, they were too old. Many had just survived, they had all survived the 6-week crossing of the North Atlantic. They were not able to work. Apart from that, the railway company had failed to make provisions for accommodation. There was supposed to be a shanty town built for this railway. Wasn't built, so there's no accommodation. The railway also refused to hire even the 300 able-bodied workers. They refused to have them. They said, that's not the deal. The deal was 300 workers, not 300 families, so we're not taking them. This went on for about 2 weeks. These people were starving. That whatever little food it had gone on the voyage. So these people were desperate. The immigration officer for New Brunswick was a man called Moses Purley, and he had very little sympathy for or liking for the Irish. He wanted Scots and English workers out there, and he made that clear. All these letters are out there and perfectly plain for people to read in the provincial archives of New Brunswick. One of his helpers, one of his assistants, was a man called James Boyd. And only for James Boyd, the assistant immigration officer at St. Andrews, most of the people from the Star would have starved in that first 2 weeks. It was, he booked against Moses Purley, he pushed against everybody else, and he managed to get money in, and he arranged food and supplies to keep these people going. He also negotiated with the railway company. Look, he knew this wasn't the deal they had made with Fitzwilliam, but this was the reality, and they agreed to take on 300 workers. Far from, they also agreed to put up some tents. The Harris Hatch was in charge of the railway at St. Andrews, and he really he didn't want to do anything, but he agreed to do the very, very minimum, at least to stop starvation. So these people who had left the Fitzwilliam estate to avoid the workhouse were now getting handouts in Canada and sleeping in tents and very makeshift shanty towns. Finally, the railway company relented and it took on these people. So things started to ease a bit. So it wasn't too bad in August and September, but October started to come in. The onslaught of it, they were looking at a Canadian winter coming in. And an awful lot of the people, the railway was going to shut up for a couple of months to let everybody go. Now, after about a week, these people were roaming around and saying, if we don't get food, we will take food. So it was going to be a rebellion. So Boyd managed to get money from somewhere, and he paid quite a few of them to cross over from St. Andrews across the river into Calais in the state of Maine. So he got him across into the United States and moved on from there. It was actually, not only was it against his policy of all sorts, it was actually against the law for him to do that at that time. So without Boyd, it was a question of do that, or there was going to be a rebellion. I'm just getting near the end of this now. Some people stayed, a lot of people in Quebec, very, very few people from the Fitzwilliam estate stayed in Quebec. Some stayed in Montreal, others moved down onto Toronto, and a few stayed around Toronto. But others went across the Great Lakes, ended up in Chicago, and then all points west. The people who went to St. Andrews, some of them, actually remarkably more than you would think, actually stayed in St. Andrews and settled there. You can see it in the next census, the 1860 census. They were still there 10 years on. And some of them, as I say, went across to the state of Maine and then down into New York or across to Chicago. And that's how they dispersed. There are thousands, tens of thousands of Americans and Canadians today who were descended from Fitzwilliam tenants. And it's the records that are there in the National Library are wonderful, because that information was always available if you were free to come over to the National Library and do the research and hopefully find the name. But now it is all online. And so anybody who wants to get, just get pen and paper handy or save it on this, but you will get the link to contact. Odd as may seem, there were benefits for Ireland. It's terrible to talk in this way, but we have to be realistic. There were economic benefits. The small farms of a couple of acres here or half an acre there, they were amalgamated into viable holdings. The poorest of the poor had either died or emigrated. And the population in Ireland in 1841 was 8 million. We haven't got back to that yet. Here we are, the best part of 200 years on, and we still have not reached our pre-famine population figures. But between 1841 and 1851, 20 million was lost, or 2 million people were lost from the population. A rough calculation has shown that about 1 million emigrated and 1 million died. In County Wicklow, the population had been 127,000 in 1841. Oh, sorry, before we get on to that, the population in 1901 in Ireland had gone from 8 million down to 2.8 million. It went on, it set in a pattern of emigration that was only broken in the last 20 or 30 years. Wicklow had a population of 127,000 in 1841. We didn't break that until the 2002 census. It's the famine is such a major psychological thing with us. It's still there. Now, the famine also bankrupted many estates, and these became known as the encumbered estates. So a second famine threatened in the late 1870s. And the people, the adults of the 1870s had been children in the 1840s. They remembered what it was like, and they said, we are not doing this. This is not a repeat. And there was a push on then for land reform. And that the Land League was formed, and the Land War came into being in the 1880s. And that led to a series of government legislation, which by 1910 did break up the great big landed estates, and the tenants were able to buy out their holdings. That's really when Ireland changed from the landlord system to farmers owning their own farms. Here's just the cover of that, the original cover of the book again. If anybody would like to just go in, coolattinlives.ie is an absolutely wonderful website. This was set up by the people down around the Coolattin Estate, and it will tell you so much information about how the state was organised. But also, not only will you see the emigration books and when people's ancestors sailed across the Atlantic, but anybody, even people who didn't emigrate or ancestors didn't emigrate, they can go in and see exactly where their ancestors were on the estate. That is, anybody interested in the Fitzwilliam estate has to look at coolattinlives.ie. I think that's about it. I'm sure I've left 101 things out, so hopefully I've given you something to maybe if you have a few questions.
Hi, Jim. No, that was absolutely terrific. Fantastic lecture there tonight. Really give a great in-depth talk there about what the immigrants had to endure on their voyage to Canada. Just a few questions, Jim. Like, I just did a bit of local history over the years around here, and I live close to Shillelagh. I noticed a lot of the middle-ranking tenants, such as you mentioned in your book. What is his name? It'll come back to me now shortly. But there was a William Sherwood, or Robert Rames. Mentioning.
Yeah.
You mentioned Robert Rames, and that he was very hard on the tenants below him.
Yes.
Robert Rames and his family ended up going to Wisconsin. What would have encouraged the Rames family to have to leave the estate?
Yeah, it all depends, because if he had, and some of the middle, the way that you're quite right about the middle tenants, they're called. The structure of the estate was such, you had the Fitzwilliams at the top. They were the owners of the 80,000 acres. And the Fitzwilliams managed the estate through their estate manager, Robert Challoner. Now, there were a body of middle tenants. Just say, for the sake of argument, we'll simplify it. Say I'm Robert Challoner, and we've 4 middle tenants, and each of those middle tenants are renting 1,000 acres each. So those middle tenants then might farm 500 acres of their 1,000, but they will get 4 or 5 subtenants that will divide up their 500, the other 500 acres. And that went on. So you could have 5 or 6 layers or tiers of tenantry. And it meant each of them was making a profit. So the guy who was actually on the bottom, the landless labourer, was the guy who in real terms was paying the highest rent of all, so all the others could cream off. Now, many landlords, not just the guys who actually own the estate, but many middle tenants who were in themselves landlords, they were hit by the famine. Because, right, I'm a middle tenant and I have to pay the rent on 1,000 acres to Fitzwilliam. But suddenly, say there's 3 or 4 of my tenants can't pay me. Well, then I have no money to pay Fitzwilliam. So my holding of 1,000 acres is in danger. So I'm as much in danger of being bankrupt as the guy with 5 acres or something like that. So we got many of them then who saw the writing on the wall. And certainly by 1850, they had 5 years of the famine. And we now know that the famine finished around 1850, but they didn't. As far as they knew, it was going to come again in 1851, 52, or 53, or whenever. So if they had money, and still money, rather than hang on and lose it all, a lot of them did emigrate while they still had something to emigrate with.
There's 2 ironies, I should say, involved in this episode, and that's the Dunbrody and the ships that left near us. We have a Father John Joseph Kavanagh. You've probably heard of him. He was Dean of Notre Dame University in America. His grandparents all came from near Shillelagh. He ended up becoming the chaplain for the Kennedy family. And John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, their great-grandfather, as we know, sailed aboard the Dunbrody from New Ross to America. But also, it's a sad irony that Kathleen Kennedy would die in a plane crash with Lord Fitzwilliam's grandson.
That's right. Yeah.
It's when you look at it like that, it's surreal. Just looking at some of the questions here now. There's great positive feedback here from everybody. Everyone's saying well done. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
You're a fantastic storyteller. And just coming to you now, we have. Would your local analysis, would it be replicated widely across the country? This is from Liam now. Would it be replicated widely across the country, or would you feel it's isolated pockets that are generally looked at?
You mean the way the Fitzwilliams handled it, or is it? Oh no, the actual famine experience was more or less right across the country. That's where it was unusual. That's where the Great Famine of the 1840s stood out. I mentioned earlier that potato blight and resultant famine were fairly regular occurrences on a 20-year, 30-year cycle. But when it happened earlier, when it happened before, it could be very, very concentrated, but in a small area. Or if it was widespread, it wasn't quite as virulent as it was. The 1840s, it was very, very virulent and very, very widespread. The main difference is how the landlords in each area handled it. As I said, I'm trying to give Fitzwilliams their due in the system they operated in the system that they were part of. They were among the best, they were among the most humane. I don't think that can be argued. I get people arguing with me on this all the time. Actually, the one thing about something like this, when you talk about British landlords in Ireland and how to handle it, no matter, you can tell the same story and 200 people, and 200 people will say, I'm whitewashing them. And the 100 people will say, I'm whitewashing them, and the other 100 will say, I'm blackening them. So it's just people have their own perception on these things. But to me, and everybody has to make up their own mind. This sounds like a sales pitch, but it's not really. If you can get the book and read the story, you make up your own mind. But to me, they were among the best of a bad bunch. There were a lot worse landlords. Give you some idea. Many, many landlords, particularly over west, over around Roscommon and Leitrim, mass eviction. You were just put out on the road. If you couldn't pay your rent, that was it. No safety net, nothing. In the Fitzwilliam clearances, when they identified families that they wanted to leave the estate, and you didn't have to go, in the emigration books, there are side notes saying refuses to go. And they weren't kicked off the estate. If they didn't want to, as long as they were paying the rent, they weren't kicked off. And not only did you have a choice to go, well, when I say that, it's before anyone latches onto that, believe me, it's not much of a choice. It's either go or go into the workhouse. It's not much of a choice. But Fitzwilliam not only paid your fare over there, but he also, the one thing I couldn't get was, beside many entries in the immigration books, is the word chest, C-H-E-S-T, and it wasn't hundreds of them. And it wasn't after a while until it dawned on me, there were sea chests. Each family was given a chest to put a few possessions in, their clothes, their tools, particularly if they were tradespeople or farmers who were able to bring a few basic tools with them. And so he also supplied, in addition to the rations that were entitled to on board the ship that were there in the Passenger Acts, Fitzwilliam also supplied them with rice, bags of rice, which is probably the favourite food on board ship for the ship's captain's point of view as well. Stores better, everything else, so much in its favour. But Fitzwilliam did underwrite a hell of a lot of it. He also, because the Fitzwilliam estate is 60 to 70 miles north of New Ross, he put on as many carriages and farm carts as he could to transport young families and older people, so they wouldn't have to walk the 70 miles down to New Ross. So there were lots of little things. Now, I'm sure that did not happen across the country. Isolated pockets, I'm sure did, but I only know really the Fitzwilliam experience because that's the one I've studied so closely, and they were exceptional.
Did Dunbrody come back from Canada empty? So did it have passengers or other cargo, like, or what was the return journey like?
I'm glad that's a point I should have made. Remember I said they were very good ships. They were just used, they weren't passenger ships, they were used for the wrong purpose. Because when they would drop their passengers in Quebec, they would take on timber. And the main the main export from Canada at that time was timber. Here were all these virgin forests, millions of acres of virgin forests. And so timber was their big export. So it would take on timber, and it would take the timber from Quebec to Liverpool, and then come back from Liverpool with a few things from Liverpool to New Ross, load the people in New Ross for the run back out to Quebec. And they made 2 runs in the summer. The St. Lawrence Seaway freezes in the winter, and certainly did then. The climate was colder then, and it certainly froze over. So they would leave New Ross in April. They would try to make the round trip to be back here in June, and then leave again in July to be back here in October. And that was the run, and you come back with a cargo. So in many ways, to think of how those people were treated and regarded, do not think of them as passengers. There were human cargo out and timber cargo back.
Good question here, actually, from Cheryl Willis. Is there any evidence of Lord? Is there any evidence of Lord Fitzwilliam and his opinion about the conditions on the ships, or what was happening at Grosse Ile?
Yes, he did. He was a remarkable individual because in the estate book, I've come to one of the things, just your point on the ships particularly, he insisted that all Fitzwilliam estate tenants boarding ships at New Ross had to be medically examined, and they had to be medically examined when they reached Quebec, and the same when they reached that one shipload that went to St. Andrews. So he was concerned about it, but I mentioned the 22,000 tenants, right? The estate management books are in the National Library, and these are letters back and forth. When Robert Challoner, his agent, would send correspondence back and forth to London, the Fitzwilliams only spent about a month a year at the Wicklow estate. The rest he was in the Houses of Parliament as well, and then he had his other estates in England. So I only spent about a month in Wicklow, County Wicklow. So Challoner, when he sent a letter to Fitzwilliam to keep him abreast of what was happening, he would also make a copy of that letter into a ledger. And all those ledgers are there, all the letters are there. And it's remarkable. Here's Fitzwilliam tied up with all this other stuff, and he's interested in railways and everything else. The number of times where a letter would say, Mrs. Byrne of such and such a townland wants to improve her hold, and she wants to know, will we contribute to that? And Fitzwilliam would answer back, well, we gave her money 3 years ago when she did such and such a thing. Now that is absolutely, to me, that's remarkable. I'm not sure if it's good or bad. I'm not sure if it marks him out to be a saint or a sinner, but it's still remarkable. And so he did keep a very, very close watch what was happening on the estate and what was happening. He was very much fired up about what happened out in Canada with the railway situation in New Brunswick, but not fired up enough that he withdrew his money from it. He still, when the railway line was finally complete, 4 or 5 years later, the very first rail engine to run on that line from St. Andrews to Quebec was the Lord Fitzwilliam. So he kept in there. He didn't pull away that much.
Yeah, he's very much noticed to have been a very liberal landlord. Actually, you can even say all the Fitzwilliams, most of the Earl Fitzwilliams throughout the 18th and 19th century were very, very liberal, especially to their, not just in politics, but in their estates as well. We actually have this lecture is after getting you a sale. We have Christina McMullen just found and purchased your book on Amazon in the USA. We have a question here from Jane. I have a family, the Mortons of Muckla, listed for emigration in 1854, but they appear in the 1860 account for residence. Was this unusual that they stayed after being listed, and what do you think?
Funny enough, the way when she said the name Morton, or when you said the name Morton, that rang a bell immediately. I remember coming across that because it's kind of an unusual name for the area. And no, I mentioned that when the family was listed in the immigration book, there were cases of family refuses to go, or there were even cases where one or two members of a family refused to go. They preferred to stay here and kind of fight it out, stick it out and see what had happened. So there were cases like the Mortons that will actually appear in the immigration books, but you will find them 6, 7, 8 years further on, actually still as tenants. You will even find some of the names that appear in the 1847 list appear again in the 1848 list, and the same family names and the ages, so you know it's the same family. So obviously you could see, right, they were ready to go in 1847. Maybe one of them got sick, who knows, for one reason, they didn't go then, but it would go the next year. So that happened.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Like, when I was just doing the bit of local history book, and we had the names of the immigration books in the National Library. But by any chance, did you ever look at the parish records for Aghold, the parish of Aghold? They're digitized, and you can get them online on Irish genealogy. And if you look at the record from around the 1840s and 1850s, you'll actually see marked in pencil, America, gone to America. And there's a lot of families there that must have financed themselves. They didn't go through the assisted immigration.
Exactly. That's a good point. Because you have, there were two types of immigration. There were the self-financed ones, like the group I mentioned earlier before we went on there, about there is a similar story for that area that was organised by a parish priest who brought people out, but they must have enough money to be able to set up by themselves when they got there and not become a burden on the rest of the group. So you had this self-financed migration, and that accounted for about 80% of feminine immigration from Ireland. Assisted immigration was only a small percentage. So at the same time that Fitzwilliam was financing immigration from the estate, people in the next field were funding their own means of escape. I just have a look that in the book. Yeah, here we are. Like how, yeah, there were 422 people in there in 1841, and there were 288 in 1851 census. So there was a drop off of 150 people, about a quarter of the people. That was more. There's probably about a 30% drop in population in a whole. So I'm not surprised it's that it appears in the parish books.
I think it's actually the townland of Ballynulta, just beside Shillelagh. That was the worst hit, wasn't it? And then Killinure, which is my home townland. They were the two worst townlands.
All the statistics are in here, and you would get it in somewhere. No, Ballynulta. Oh, yeah. You're right, Ballynulta. 1841, there were 621 people. 1851, 349. 1861, 222, 400 people in 20 years. A drop of 400 people. So there was a drop of over 66% in Ballynulta.
Very sad. Jim, thanks for tonight. This is it's great to actually have a lecture now delving into the famine period, and especially looking at it through a microscopic look into, especially into County Wicklow. I do recommend everybody, if you don't have Jim's book, Surplus People, I recommend you search for it online. It's an excellent book. It's a great story. It's not one of those typical history books that you might go after halfway through. It's just a perfect story as you read along. It's just like tonight's lecture. It's a very relaxing book to read, but full of facts. Very detailed book. And I'd like to thank Jim on behalf of Traston is here for coming on tonight and giving us this fantastic lecture. It'll be on YouTube probably tomorrow, so you can be able to catch it on YouTube on the Traston is here YouTube channel. And just thanks again, Jim.
You're welcome. Glad to do it.
Good man. Good man.